Welcome back to the next section of A Closer Look at First Peter with Dr. Wilson J. Tyree. We are in chapter 3, beginning in verse 1. In the same way, wives, be in subjection to your own husbands, so that even if any don't obey the word, they may be won by the behavior of their wives without a word, seeing your pure behavior coupled with respect. Some might take offense to Peter's comparison of wives to slaves. He starts out the chapter saying, in the same way, wives, referring back to the problem of slaves and masters in chapter 2. But in his defense, he seems to have in mind the outcome of a life well lived by the wife, whether the husband be a good husband or a bad husband, as being similar to the outcome of the life well lived by the slave, whether their master be a good master or an evil master, as opposed to the simple designation of wives as being slaves to their husbands. The careful reader might also notice that Paul makes use of the slave analogy when describing the youth of the Israelite nation compared to the more grown-up nature of the church. Over in Galatians 4, the apostle describes the heir of the household as being no better off than a slave, because he's not yet old enough to be completely free, and must be held under the sway of parental rules and governance until they grow up. But the wife wields so much more power than does the child or the slave. No one on the planet shares more intimate moments or shares more confidences than does the wife. And of course, many of us choose our wives, at least in part, because we find them physically attractive. We should not construe Peter's pleas to mean that women should strive to be physically unappealing. However, physical, outward attractiveness will always draw attention, and sometimes rewards, to the individual, while spiritual or inward attractiveness points to a more important source. If the husband isn't listening to the spoken word of God, says Peter, perhaps when he sees that message illustrated in the life of his wife, he will be drawn closer to the truth. Verse 3. Let your beauty be not just the outward adorning of the braiding of the hair, and of wearing jewels of gold, or of putting on fine clothing, but in the hidden person of the heart, in the incorruptible adornment of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is very precious in the sight of God. For this is how in the past the holy women who hoped in God also adorned themselves, being in subjection to their own husbands. So Sarah obeyed Abraham and called him Lord, whose children you now are, if you do well, and are not put in fear by any terror. Paul also describes a bit of a dress code for Christian women when he writes his first letter to Timothy in chapter 2. I find it interesting that this teaching was equally important to Jewish women of the dispersion and to a young minister, who I'm guessing that Timothy was single at the time, trying to guide the cultural habits of church members in Asia Minor. The juxtaposition of outward adorning and inward spiritual cultivation is equally as important to the 21st century woman. Modern culture is consumed with the way women look. Our wives and daughters are inundated with demand, often made by people they've never met, to purchase clothing, cosmetics, and accessories that will make them look more like the airbrushed babes in the magazine. Instead of seeking a godly heart and a spirit of service, they are somehow convinced that if they do not conform to the cultural norm, they will die old, ugly, and alone. Of course, in Peter's day, many wives were chosen for their husbands and had little to say about the matter. It may have been very important to them to retain their standing by enhancing their appearance. And even today, many women see very little worth in their own lives if they cannot achieve the level of beauty they see in the latest issue of Cosmo. When writing to these women of the dispersion, however, Peter held up a different set of heroines for their immolation. Those women of old are the wives of the patriarchs of the Hebrew people. They're the great-grandmother of them all. Sarah was willing to do whatever it took to help Abraham be faithful and successful, even if some of her plans were less than successful. And if you haven't read, back around Genesis 12 through 15 lately, you could go back and look at some of the wins and losses with Abraham and Sarah as they tried to figure out the best way to follow the Lord. Verse 7, you husbands, in the same way, live with your wives according to knowledge, giving honor to the woman as to the weaker vessel, as also being joint heirs of the grace of life, that your prayers may not be hindered. Once again, it would be easy to center on Peter's comment about the women being the weaker vessel and fly right past the real challenge. Peter calls on husbands to pay attention to the needs of their wives and refers to them as joint heirs of grace. While the question of physical strength and competency to do some particular job might be open to discussion, there's no greater or lesser reward of grace for the husband or for the wife. The Apostle Paul, who seemingly remained a single man all of his life, had plenty to say about how husbands and wives should treat each other. And you might go read Ephesians 5:22 through 33, or its companion piece, Colossians chapter 3, verses 18 through 21. In both of those passages, Paul points to a well-balanced, though certainly husband-led, approach to marriage and family. Peter, in this particular passage, connects the dots by strongly implying that a man ought not to expect God to treat him well, that is, answer his prayers, while he's treating one of God's family members, even though she might be his wife, with disrespect. In human terms, I'm sure the fathers among us can imagine a similar scenario. What if a young man was successful in wooing and marrying our daughter, but soon thereafter began treating her with utter disrespect? How likely would we be to give him any special consideration? On the contrary, I have friends who would immediately threaten to do him harm. Not me, of course, just friends. Verse 8, finally, all of you be like-minded, compassionate, loving as brothers, tender-hearted, courteous, not rendering evil for evil or insult for insult, but instead blessing, knowing that you were called to this, that you may inherit a blessing. For he who would love life and see good days, let him keep his tongue from evil and his lips from speaking deceit. Let him turn away from evil and do good. Let him seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are open to their prayer, but the face of the Lord is against all those who do evil. From slavery to Christ's ultimate sacrifice, from godly women to loving husbands at prayer, the overall theme of this section is self-control, or perhaps we should say Christ control. I've heard it described in several ways. Don't give anyone the remote control to your life. Act, don't just react. And maybe my favorite, no one can steal from you what you freely give to them. Jesus was God in the flesh, and he knew it. That one fact was enough to keep him from giving in to the desire to flatten the planet and just go home. When Roman soldiers beat him and Jewish leaders mocked him, it was only his royal identity that stayed his hand. When the crowd yelled, "If you are the Messiah, come down from the cross," it was only his own understanding of what he was there to offer that stopped him from complying. Grace is made of the fabric of Jesus' understanding of his own identity and mission. I'm going to read that line again. Grace is made of the fabric of Jesus' understanding of his own identity and mission. In the same way, We can only respond in the fashion Peter is prescribing if we know exactly who we are and whose we are. I can refrain from reviling, hating, fighting back, defending self the moment I realize that I truly am a child of God. Not just some random church member or pew-sitting serf in search of eternal treasure, but God's child, a joint heir with Jesus. Whatever might happen to us on this planet, we do not have to respond in kind. We have the mind of Christ. And I would reference you to 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 13 through 16, and 1 Corinthians 3, verses 21 through 23. I'll see you later.